Hi, and welcome back to Chris Dyer's Creative Friends, the super awesome podcast show where me, your artist friend Chris Dyer, talks and has awesome conversations with all his very creative friends. So today, I will have Daniel Pinchbeck as my guest. He is coming over to Denver to write a book with me, which is crazy. He is part of the Galactic Gang NFT community, and we want to write a novel. So we're gonna have some great conversations together and come up with a great story for our series. But so if you don't know who Daniel Pinchbeck is, he's a writer of many very interesting books, a philosopher, activist, psychonaut, and just a very smart, interesting person. So I hope you'll enjoy our conversations. Blessings!
While the world is burning, got to make amends. Walk on the sunny side with a positive lens. Talks about passion between the women and the men. Chris Dyer and his creative friends. Darling, ooh, ooh,
Hey, how you doing, Daniel?
I'm good. How's it going?
Pretty good. Thanks for being here in Denver these days.
Yeah.
And for sitting here in my backyard to answer these questions. Thanks for being part of the Galactic Gang.
Yeah.
And for helping with this novel that you'll be writing.
Yeah.
Super stoked. So you are originally from New York, correct?
That's true.
You lived there all your life?
Yeah.
Nice. How is it today compared to back when you were a kid or even a teenager? How's it changed in all these decades?
Wow, that's a deep question. I mean, so I'm like in my 50s, so I can remember like the early 70s or whatever. I mean, I remember like the whole taxi driver stage when it was really decrepit and
Grimy.
Grimy, drugs
Dangerous.
were everywhere, dangerous. I remember my dad was an artist in Soho, so I remember the early days of Soho when there wasn't like any galleries even, and the galleries came and it was super chic, and then it became like the fashion area. So yeah, it's just, what I guess I feel at this point is it's still an amazing place, and you might fall in love with like a bookstore or a gallery or something and it moves away, but then you think that that's the city's going down, but then something else pops back up. And right now it feels like a really amazing time. I mean, post-pandemic, it feels like there's a lot of energy there, and I don't know, just...
Did a lot of people move out and new people move in?
Apparently, in my neighborhood in the East Village, apparently a lot of older people moved out, a lot of younger people moved in because the rent suddenly like shot down so people could get back in the neighborhood.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's awesome. Hopefully more artistic people like yourself.
Yeah.
Nice. So tell me about your parents. You were telling me your mom dated Jack Kerouac back in on the road days?
Yeah, my mother was, when she was 21, she was going out with Jack Kerouac, who was in his, a bit older, and she was with him when he published On the Road, which was like a generation-defining book. I find that a lot of young people these days have never even really read the Beats or heard that much about them.
Really? That's crazy, huh?
But On the Road, was one of the books that helped kind of like create the 60s and the whole hippie movement and so on. And he'd been living, kind of an unknown, he'd written all these novels, he couldn't get them published for years. He'd done a lot of drugs, he kind of damaged himself, I guess.
That's before he became famous?
Yeah, he wrote On the Road in like 49 and it didn't come out till 57, so it was like 8 years.
Oh, wow.
And all these other books that couldn't get published.
It was before its time.
Before its time. So when the book finally came out, she was with him, and he got this rave review in the New York Times that changed his whole life. He became like the most famous writer of that time, and she used to go with him to all these talk shows, but he was really psychologically unprepared for the fame. He was actually kind of a fragile person.
Right.
And so he would get massively drunk before getting on the shows, and he would start raving at the talk show host that he was waiting for God to show him his face and stuff. And so and then she was a writer. She actually ended up writing a memoir called Minor Characters, about her experience growing up in that period and what it was like to be around like Ginsberg and Kerouac. And all
Do
those
you
guys.
get to meet Kerouac or Ginsberg?
Kerouac, I didn't get to meet, but I met Ginsberg. I knew quite a bit when I was young.
Wow.
And used to have like lunch with him, and I found him like a really inspirational person.
Wow.
Yeah.
That he was very inspirational for me, and back in college days. His poems are very special and just such a unique character back in the 50s, right?
60s. I mean, he was very famous in the 60s. He became like
Once the hippie
yeah. I
movement.
mean, like the Beatles probably took their name from the Beats. Like, I don't think a lot of people even realize how significant they were. Bob Dylan was like definitely influenced a lot by Ginsberg. Yeah, he was a great guy. I really liked him.
Nice. And did all that influence kind of like inspire you to be a writer yourself or artistic
Yeah,
person?
definitely. I mean, my mother was more of a conventional novelist and memoirist, but kind of like how I got into the psychedelic thing was I worked in like mainstream magazines in New York as a journalist. Then I had kind of a spiritual crisis, and then I kind of remembered the Beat heritage because they were all about like you needed to explore things for yourself and you needed to pursue, personal discovery, personal liberation, whatever, consciousness. So, and they'd actually been among the first, like Burroughs was one of the first to take ayahuasca. Then he got Ginsberg to do. Ginsberg was one of the early ones.
What year is this?
That was like 52. There's a book called The Yahe Letters. Burroughs went down because he was trying to cure himself from heroin addiction.
Wow.
So he went down to, I guess, Peru. And he had like horrible experiences, but I think they very much inspired like how he ended up writing like Naked Lunch and so on.
Wow. Very, very interesting.
And my dad was an abstract painter who never really became well known. He was kind of like an outsider artist. But yeah, I still love his work and I still have like a ton of it.
Right. And you talk a lot about the importance of art in order to transform the world back to the positive. Tell me the importance of art, because this is a podcast mostly about artists and stuff.
Yeah.
Tell me your points of views.
Yeah, I mean, I see myself as an artist even if I write nonfiction mainly. I mean, well, I think art, opens up imaginative possibilities for what humanity could be, and it allows us to, think beyond maybe the limits, of what we have in terms of economic systems, political systems,
Beautiful. How many books have you written? And can you go over like very briefly what each book is kind of like about?
I mean, I've written a bunch of like shorter books that I self-published on Amazon recently. That's been like an experiment, like 70 or 80 page books. But for me, there was like the first three were Breaking Open the Head, that came out in 2002, which was about psychedelic shamanism. And I went to like Africa. I went through the Bwiti initiation in Gabon. I went to the Amazon to take ayahuasca with the Sequoia. I visited the Mazatec Indians in Mexico. I wrote about like the whole, Burning Man cultural, world. And at that time, the book kind of, reached the mainstream, probably helped change the, kind of cultural discussion around psychedelics, which really, like in the 90s in New York, like people just laughed at psychedelics, like the New York Times ridiculed them. And also they were very taboo. Like when the book was published, I used to be like scared that I was getting like, stopped on airplanes or, if I tried to come back into the country or whatever. So it's interesting, over the time to see the embracing of psychedelics, by the culture, by the mainstream culture. And my second book was kind of like my most successful book. It was 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl. And that book was looking at the prophecies of different cultures around the world, including like the, Mesoamerican cultures, like the Maya and the Aztecs, the Hopi in North America, and then also, kind of like the apocalypse tradition in Western culture, like, Jewish, Christian, Islam. Carl Jung was a big part of it, and the book was really. I mean, I through the
that was a bestseller, right?
Yeah, through the psychedelic work, I'd had a lot of, I guess, paranormal psychic phenomena. That I was at first I started as like a skeptic and a materialist. So as that happens,
tap this tree out. There you
go. So that was very surprising. So I tried to understand, if the materialist worldview wasn't accurate, then how could we like logically look at the world? And so I looked at people like Carl Jung and scientists like Amit Goswami and Dean Radin and so on, people who explore psychic phenomena and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So those are your two main books, and then you also...
The third one was called How Soon Is Now. That came out. So then I started a company and a nonprofit, and felt that it wasn't enough to be a writer, because I was very concerned that, that 2012 was going to be like a big transformation. That I felt like we only had a short amount of time looking at what was happening, like ecologically and also like politically, to kind of like incite some larger movement, of change. So it took me 10 years to finish the third book, which was How Soon Is Now.
Wow.
And that was more of an effort to kind of, starting from the sort of, psychedelic experience of deconditioning and deprogramming, to kind of rethink how, like we could use like social systems and economic systems, technologies to, have a more regenerative society. And, because at the moment, we're still really suffering from this ongoing ecological emergency, and we haven't resolved, the military and geopolitical stuff. And I feel there needs to be more generalists who just think through stuff on like a systems level.
Mm-hmm. And Afterlife is your latest book?
Yes, that's one of the more short books that I self-published. I also wrote a book that came out a few years ago called When Plants Dream, with my friend Sophia Rockland, who's an anthropologist. And that was it's almost like a biography of ayahuasca. It was like a history of the plant and what we can know about its uses and what we're learning about it in terms of like medicine and science and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's been a few books since then. One was called The Occult Control System, which you would probably like, where I was looking at like, extraterrestrials, UFOs, ideas around. In the 2012 book, I wrote a lot about the crop circles that appear in fields in England, which I think there are, many good reasons, having spent time over there during that phenomenon, to think that, maybe it wasn't just made by humans. Maybe there was some other energy kind of interacting with us in a way.
Yeah, it's alien graffiti.
Exactly. Yeah. Or it's messaging or something.
Nice.
Then most recently this book Afterlife, which was kind of looking at there's actually a lot of evidence for this possibility that, death is not the end of everything. I mean, there's all these reports of children who spontaneously remember their past lives, near-death experience where people are able to remember like everything around them, and mediumship is really extraordinary. So I was trying to put together also kind of thinking through how could this be possible, or what would it mean in terms of, our understanding of the nature of reality.
Right. So all of these topics are generally not part of the mainstream narrative or conversation. Do you meet a lot of resistance from it, or did you used to receive more resistance before and now it's being more accepted and maybe it's more being highlighted and valued?
I would say a lot of resistance. I mean, I feel kind of like exiled, canceled a bit also, in some ways. But I mean, I feel, I kind of feel like a sadness, because I feel like, our culture would be benefited if we could explore a lot of these topics more seriously. And it still kind of surprises me, because they were, a lot of these topics were of like the greatest concern for other cultures. Like, Mesoamerican cultures were obviously completely interested in, the psychic realms and shamanism and, exploration of other dimensions. I mean, you see it in their art, which is in some ways similar to what you do. Egypt and other cultures had a tremendous interest in like the afterlife and how to prepare for it and what that meant, or Tibetan Buddhism or something. But, Western secular culture still can't really go there, and it's kind of stuck in other topics.
Really? Is it not opening up a little bit its mind, like at least on psychedelics?
Well, psychedelics for sure, but I mean, I'm like kind of like feel that the way that the psychedelics are now being pulled into like the business and the capitalist thing, it's very complicated, and it's concerns me in some ways, because they're kind of like domesticating the experience. They're making it very focused on the two areas of like, healing, therapy, and then, microdosing for creativity. Mm-hmm. And those are both amazing, but, I think there's even deeper levels to it.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Yeah. What's the medicine that you work with the most with?
So yeah, I mean, I've taken a break for a few years. I kind of wanted to just, figure myself out a little bit separate from psychedelics, because for a long time that was like, such a part of my life. But I would say ayahuasca has been the most profound. I mean, I did iboga twice. The first journey in Africa is what's just written about in the first book, and that one was, also really incredible. But not something one would probably do a lot.
Right. I've never done iboga, but like, how would you compare ayahuasca and iboga?
Iboga is a lot longer lasting. It's like 20, 25 hours.
Wow.
And it has
Sounds
a number of very
exhausting.
specific phases. It is pretty exhausting. But it's also my experience of it was like the first time, very psychoanalytical. Like, it took you back to your early childhood. And you definitely felt, as you sometimes feel with ayahuasca, there's like a guiding energy or being associated to it, which seems, kind of masculine, whereas ayahuasca seems quite feminine. Yeah, I mean, it's an extraordinary, tool.
Beautiful. Yeah. So something that we're working together is on the project of the Galactic Gang, which is an NFT series, and we're coming on with our own myths and stories to reflect on the journey or the hero's journey of humanity. What's the importance of myths for humanity in order to learn about itself and grow?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think human beings need myths in order to live, and even kind of materialism is a myth of matter. It's this idea that the only thing that matters is what can be quantified or known in that sense. The Big Bang is a myth. I mean, it may be the case, but then scientists keep finding maybe it's not the case or whatever. So, I think having, new myths gives us like new possibilities for, how we can live and what we can think about and how we can dream and so on.
Right. The understanding of who we are in this process hopefully empowers us more to become the hero of the story we live, at least in our personal lives, but hopefully gives us hope that we can succeed in the end and we're not defeated for doom and gloom.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just super fun. I mean, the characters are super fun, and they kind of called out to me when I, began to look at them and look at your art of like, what would be like a story or a narrative or mythological kind of world in which, these beings were embedded, and what kind of conflicts were they having, or what was their mission or whatever.
Yeah, well, I'm excited for this thing we're creating together. So NFTs and crypto are something new, and in your newsletter you seem to explore it a little bit. Can you tell me a little bit of your points of views, or
Sure. I mean, it's complicated. I mean, I think it's, like many things, it's like, good and bad. I mean, what I'm loving about it is it seems to be opening up some new creative spaces, and this idea that the sort of NFTs instantly create like this community, and then you can explore. I mean, it's kind of like a new kind of like unification of like, commerce, community, art,
technology, metaverse.
Yeah. I have also looked really closely at some of the criticisms of the whole thing. Like, there's a famous video, or it's become very famous, called "The Line Goes Up," where he really argues that that they're really, more kind of like PR for this crypto industry, and that, this negative view would be that the crypto industry is really more of a kind of like a, something like a Ponzi scheme or a pyramid scheme, where they have to keep bringing more people in because there's no like underlying, real value.
But isn't it the same as normal money or the central reserve, currency?
I can't really say that I think that's the case, and I know that argument. I mean, even if you don't like the U.S. and and definitely the financial system, as we saw in like 2008, is like kind of corrupt, but still the fiat currency is backed by like a sort of legacy of like everything that the U.S. has built: schools, institutions, legal code, highways.
It was a big agreement we've all made as a society, but it's not backed by gold anymore, so it's just kind of like faith believed in a way.
Well, it's still backed by everything that the society is. I mean, including its military, but it's history, centuries of legal dispute and centuries of governance and territory. I mean, there's still a lot of real stuff that backs a national currency, whereas you can't really say that for Bitcoin.
But like, it seems like they can just print it whenever they want and give it to themselves. Is that fair?
Yeah, I'm not, as I said, I don't think that to say that the current system, is really problematic and corrupt. I mean, I totally agree with that. But I love that the crypto world shows us that we could define, other ways of creating and trading value. But it's also like I'm a little bit concerned. Yeah, I mean, I'm a philosopher and a critic, so it's like things concern me. For instance, like we saw with the Web 2.0, we thought it was going to be liberation, and Google was like, do no evil, and Facebook was make the world more open and connected. And then over time, these very powerful tools ended up maybe having some negative effects in terms of like surveillance and now censorship, and that's very complicated. So and that was all about media and communications. I mean, and with crypto, it's kind of we're doing the same thing for money that we did for media, and if it's not handled very carefully, what seems like promise or liberation might actually become even deeper mechanisms of control, because for instance with crypto, like if they create central bank issued digital currencies, it'll all be like completely trackable, so every transaction and they'll be able to sort of like turn your money off and on, like they just did in Canada with that trucker protest.
Right, but they're already doing it with normal money. Like the hope is that with crypto they couldn't do that because it's decentralized and more in the hands of the people, right?
Yeah, it's just, I mean, as I said, it's like I completely hope that it turns out to be an amazing thing. I mean, I tend to be a little bit critical, and also I remember the promises of previous tech revolutions. Everybody like, this is going to be the great opening that's going to allow for all this liberation, but actually the corporations and the governments somehow learn to benefit, and with this I just I'm hopeful, but also I see a lot of potential threats.
Right. Well, it seems like these kinds of technologies always start by like the small people at the bottom with good intentions, but then as they grow, money comes in, they get corrupted and coerced, and it seems like governments and corporations take over and they kind of ruin it by making it all about money and control.
So, I mean, so for instance, like a critique of the whole smart contract thing is, okay, so at the moment, like, you lease an apartment, and then let's say you lose your job, so you can't pay your rent. Generally you have quite a lot of recourse, like the landlord can't just evict you, the next day. Could take months, or maybe you go to the landlord and say, hey, can you just give me a few months off, until I figure this out, or reduce the rent or something. With smart contracts, it could be more, kind of technocratic, where, okay, like it's 12:01 on January 1st, you didn't pay the rent, so we lock your doors, and a drone turns up at your window, and you're out.
Right.
So there's a reason that there's ambiguity in legal code, in the legal system that actually works for the benefit sometimes of people, and it's possible that smart contracts will actually remove a kind of protective layer that makes society at least somewhat less unjust.
Right, a little bit of wiggle room. So these governments and corporations come and kind of like ruin it, like something that potentially could be good for us. Are we kind of screwed as long as the people in control have these bad intentions, or maybe not bad intentions, but just like are all about the money and the control? Like, how do we get rid of that? And how do, to me it seems like government always kind of fucks it up for the people. Like, what's the option? Like, how can we
I
find
think
fairness?
Maybe it's because I've gotten older or something. I mean, when I wrote How Soon Is Now, like I was really envisioning, and I still do, kind of like more of a participatory, like, particularly with all the climate stuff. I mean, I think eventually we're going to have more like the importance of like local and bioregional centers are going to grow, and hopefully the importance of these large, federal governments is going to shrink, just because they're not going to be able to handle all the chaos. And then so, and I do see a lot of my friends, trying to building, kind of regenerative communities where they're making more of their own food and all that kind of stuff. So it may go more in that direction. But I also, I guess, I do feel that, I mean, government has been like a negotiated battle, right? Like, I mean, you know, the 18th century, we freed ourselves from aristocracy, and we created like systems that gave people more participation. And then, you know, there was like, you know, labor unions and negotiations and like, you know, fighting over and over again. It's like, you know, I think that I'm a little bit concerned of the libertarian critique, you know, which is, you know, a lot of the Bitcoin people are very libertarian, that we just, you know, do away with government and that'll be better. I'm afraid that might end up serving even worse forms of autocracy or authoritarianism.
Like mafias or something?
Mafias, sure, or yeah, I mean, you know, exactly, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So,
I mean,
smaller government, or like government for more, you know, localized and not so general, because then you're more connected to the people who are close to you, and you're...
Yeah, I mean, what we would really need would be more like strengthening of like civil society, you know, outside of governments and companies. That's something that used to exist in like the 19th century. That's kind of what I was trying to do with this company, Evolver, would be like, you know, if you had like local people coming together to decide for themselves the type of world that they want, and the type of, you know, community that they want, you know, that would probably be, you know, better in some ways.
Right, well, all that sounds very logical to me, but it seems like the world's going the opposite direction, more generalized, global rulers, right?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's, I mean, that's why I freaked out, you know, back in 2007, and instead of like, you know, pursuing kind of the literary career I had, I was like, how do we, you know, what kind of systems do we create to, you know, kind of elevate people power, people's capacity for taking charge. But yeah, I mean, it looks grim. I mean, it does. It's you know, when we're not solving the environmental stuff, and we have, you know, a big shift towards more authoritarian and autocratic regimes who are able to use a lot of this technology like very, very effectively at this point, you know. But maybe it'll turn around. You know, somebody just introduced me to something called Dyer, which is like, I haven't even tried it yet, but it's like a messaging app that's totally based on the mesh network. So it basically does something like, you know, Facebook or Telegram, but it doesn't even need the centralized internet. It's all like peer-to-peer. You know, so I think there could be, you know, technological jumps that would allow us to kind of like, you know, make social change, positive social change also.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, let's hope that us, the people, keep on, you know, discovering and creating technologies that benefit us to have like free conversations without censorship or too much control. So what is your point of view about the World Economic Forum, like Karl Schwab's movement in Switzerland, I believe?
Yeah.
Yeah. Seems from the outside that it's well-intentioned, it's about the environment, but it also seems like very about control, digital IDs, some kind of communism where like people don't own anything anymore, and government
Except
owns it.
When they say you won't own anything, then the question is, why isn't it we don't own anything? It's the you. They're pointing at us, and they're saying they're still going to own everything. Yeah.
Right. So that's where I'm like, hell no. Like, I worked really hard to, you know, buy my apartment and my books and records, and, you know, as I don't want to be materialistic, but I still want to enjoy these things that make me happy.
Yeah.
So what's your point of view about that whole movement and how they're infiltrating governments? And, you know, back in your old speeches, you would even say like, hey, maybe it's good that we don't own anything because that's less resources, that's better for the environment. But now that it's closer to happening, does it feel correct?
Well, I mean, I guess ideally, I mean, you know, I'm maybe an anarchist or socialist or something. But I you know, feel there should be more commons, more collectively owned resources. I think wealth inequality is like one of the biggest problems, and the top like, you know, 0.1% or 1% use like the massive amounts of resources. I don't really see any reason why, you know, people need to have the resources to build $600 million private yachts, you know, like Bezos is doing, like Putin owns. So I think you know, a sane system would be a lot less wealth inequality, which also really values like, you know, certain types in our society, certain types of work is very much valued over other types of work. So if somebody's like a caretaker, like a nurse, or works with autistic kids, you know, they'll probably never be able to buy like an apartment or whatever. But if somebody manipulates, you know, third world currencies from, you know, very effectively, you know, from a finance trading company, you know, that person will be able to own like 6 houses all around the world. So I don't think that's a good system. Like our system is not, supporting like the more humane values. So I don't know how we break that. But in terms of the World Economic Forum, yeah, I mean, it's become kind of like a catchphrase, right? But essentially, yeah, you have a lot of corporations, technocrats, powerful people who, they see themselves actually as, I think, as the noble ones who, want to do good, but they often want to do good in a way that increases their own power and control. And the big problem we have is that our technologies have accelerated so quickly, yet kind of like our, moral, ethical development has not kept pace. That's kind of the problem. And so, so when you have technologies that allow to like surveillance for everybody, or now they're learning how kind of easy it is to control a lot of people's minds, right, through indoctrination, through propaganda, and so on. We're in a real battle zone right now,
Yeah.
But it's not like I don't, I think we have to get past the stage of demonizing the other, and recognize that it's like these systemic forces that are pushing us into different directions, I don't exactly know how we fix it, but so a lot of the ideas from the World Economic Forum seem pretty terrible to me too.
Yeah, but it's hard to stop that when they hold all the cards and they own the media, etc. I've also said like, hey, maybe they're like well-intentioned people with power, and they see that the world is getting overpopulated, and perhaps they have to do some things to regulate. The problem is they get to choose who stays and who goes, and who gets controlled and who doesn't. Of course, they're always going to win.
Yeah, I mean, I do know well-intentioned people who have tremendous wealth who go to things like the World Economic Forum, but it's just the whole system supports them wanting, which is very naturally very human to kind of, if you have like privilege or power in any domain, you want to amplify it, right? Like, you want to be a more successful artist,
It's kind of like the video game you're playing, you always want to do better and better.
So there it's like somehow we have to switch from like an I to like a we focus, and everything in our society kind of like works against that.
So Daniel,
Yeah.
how soon is now? What is from your personal opinion the things we should do to try to rescue the world from its ecological catastrophes, or everything? You talked about it in that book. What's some of the things you propose?
I wrote the book a while back. I have to like go back to the database. So for instance, like industrial agriculture is a huge problem, and it's like depleting the world's topsoil. So for instance, we would need to go to more like back to organic farming, permaculture. There are a lot of practices on a smaller scale that replenish soil. There's like a really beautiful film called The Biggest Little Farm, and these Hollywood guys decided to leave like the media world, and they bought a small farm that had been, it was part of like a bigger industrial farm, so it was totally, kind of barren kind of landscape. And then they applied all these principles, and then watch the film, and they filmed it for 6 years. And by the end of the 6 years, like all the birds and the animals and the insects have all come back. The whole area is like super green again. So, we would need to kind of do that on a global scale. But that also requires like, because it used to be that most people were farmers, right? Like a century or two ago. And then modernity came along, and the idea was like, oh, being a farmer is boring and you don't get anywhere. So, move to the city and work in like marketing, or get a job as like a cab driver or now an Uber driver. It's more exciting. That's the opportunity. That's the future. So we'd almost need to reverse the logic of the system, and we would need to kind of retrain people and resettle them back, so that they actually learned these techniques that would, enhance soil and biodiversity. So that's in one area. Another area would be, ultimately we would have to redesign the economic system, because one of the big problems we have is with the stock market, you have publicly traded companies that really have to only satisfy one prime directive, which is to maximize shareholder value, which is purely financial value. And that means that they're kind of like robots in a way, that they can't, so basically anything that's an externality, so for instance, to protect an area or to, not,
Ruin the environment.
yeah, exactly, costs a lot of money. So they're, to sort of deal with their fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, they actually can't do any of that stuff. They have to do the stuff, that's within the logic of the financial system, which is to exploit and maximize finance and so on. So, we would need to like fundamentally, I think, change the logic of the financial system so that things that are now seen as externalities are integrated back into how businesses, work and think.
Do you think it's possible that people will go back from the cities back to the country, or are we too many people right now? How do you observe overpopulation in general? Is the planet so big and bountiful that perhaps we could continue reproducing without destroying it? Is it like a matter of distribution, that some have too much and some have too little?
Yeah. So, I don't think that overpopulation is the biggest problem. I think, wealth inequality and the fact that, a small group of people, use so much of the resources. Apparently the top 1% use like 60% of the world's resources. And you have populations, like look at like subsistence farmers in like Bangladesh or something. They're like not contribute. They're not, and all the things that we get to do, unfortunately, like use all the school equipment and fly around and buy cool sneakers and all that stuff. If for those cultures that aren't doing any of that stuff, they're not really contributing to this ecological catastrophe. And I've visited also indigenous cultures, in the Amazon, or like the Kogi in Colombia, who also were like, imbalanced with their environment. If anything, like they enhance the regenerative capacities of their environment through like practices that are like many, many centuries. So, I think there's things that we could, learn from those types of cultures. And I think we would, probably want to taper off the world's population. But I don't think it has to be a catastrophic collapse. But we would have to make very, very profound changes now. And and also, what we've learned over the last years is that we can make profound changes. When the coronavirus happened, we were able to shut down, all these different industries and all these different types of like office environments, and nobody starved to death. Like we were able to keep going. So, and actually, a lot of people then realized that the jobs that they had in the old system were actually kind of worthless, and in terms of, or meaningless, let's say, and are now rethinking, recalibrating. So there could be like a movement in a different direction.
Beautiful. What about energy? Renewable versus fossil. That's gonna end at some point. But then the argument to that is, say, like wind turbines take resources, solar panels take a lot of chemicals and resources to build. Is that the best solution even? What's your perspective on it?
Yeah, it looks like we would have to go through a, planetary transition to kind of lower impact forms of energy, like renewable energy. And it looks like that stuff is getting better and better. I don't know if it allows us to do what we're doing now. It's like I read Bill Gates's book on climate change, and he's looking at like carbon capture and storage, and all these high-tech possibilities don't even really exist yet. The idea is that we have to keep this type of system going. What if, once again, it sounds a little socialistic, but people shared cars and resources rather than everybody having their own car. People shared goods and services. That became more of a norm in a way. That we could reduce resource consumption, energy consumption. There's as I was researching How Soon Is Now, like really crazy things. Like one of the reasons that the world is heating up is because of the loss of the albedo effect. Albedo.
What's that?
So it's like the Antarctica and the ice caps were very white, and that reflects the sun's rays back into space.
Gotcha.
So as they get smaller due to climate change, that means that more of the sun's rays are absorbed in the Earth.
Is that a politically correct term for the ice?
Albedo?
Albino?
Not albino.
Not albino. Okay.
ALBEDO, I think.
All right.
But anyway, so if you painted all of the rooftops in urban areas white or mandated gardens, that would compensate for the loss of the albedo effect. It would be a very harmless kind of thing to do. I mean, we also have like the ocean acidification problem. The oceans have been absorbing a huge amount of the excess CO2, which is leading them to warm, and also it's affecting the life cycle of like the plankton, also like disintegrating the coral reefs. I mean, actually the plankton produce like 60% of the oxygen that we breathe, whereas tropical forests produce like 20%. So theoretically you could address acidification in the oceans if you
to stop fishing?
Well, no, you could create huge aquaculture, kelp farms, because kelp leaches out the CO2 as it grows. So if you, I mean, it would be a massive undertaking, but if you converted 6% of the world's oceans to a giant kelp farm, that would, and also kelp is like edible. It can be used, for, soil or whatever. That would be a way to reverse the acidification of the oceans.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do the powers that be know this? Are they doing something about it? Is anybody on it, or?
The problem is, I think that, and this is what I got into in How Soon Is Now, is that like the Bill Gates, that type of or the World Economic technocratic approach is to want to apply more high tech, futuristic, hyper technologies, whereas like a lot of the actual solutions are actually more low technology, but they require more human capital to move back in that direction, which means shifting the direction away from, more technological evolution as like the answer, So another example is like biochar. You know about biochar?
I've heard of it, but please tell me.
So it's like they discovered that the Amazon jungle was very much actually protected and stewarded by the indigenous people, partially through this process called biochar, where they would create a slow burning. They would take the organic matter, they would burn it very, very slowly, and it would create this kind of carbon-rich tilth, which they would then redistribute on the jungle soil, because actually the Amazon soil is very thin and very fragile. And so they discovered that they can make commercial biochar, which produces heat and energy, and then ends up keeping the CO2 in the ground, and then distributable in a way that helps soil. But so yeah, stuff like that, which is kind of like these like low tech, then also like certain microorganisms that could have tremendous value, Anyway, so those are some of the possible solution points. I mean, one idea that I really came to in How Soon Is Now, which I think is a very like psychedelic kind of an insight, was like, if we think about humanity and the Earth altogether as like one giant sort of symbiotic organism, like we're having this gigantic effect on everything that's happening on the planet right now, the hydrosphere, the geosphere, the biodiversity web, and so on. So like if we're one giant organism, then what are the organs of this giant organism? I mean, you could say nation states, but actually I think it's corporations. Like energy companies are like, the circulation system that's moving like the blood through the body, or like media companies are like the eyes and the ears, which are taking in raw sense data and then converting it into the memes. So this idea is that, now, so in evolution, there's kind of a shift from kind of aggression to symbiosis. Like immature ecosystems have a lot of like violence and destruction, but as ecosystems mature, they become more and more symbiotic. Like trees are like incredibly symbiotic organisms, right? Like they don't hardly destroy anything. They shelter like all these different types of life, like insects, birds, worms, snakes, and so on. So, you could imagine that if there was a shift in the economic system, corporations could go from being kind of aggressors to actually being these sort of symbiotic organs of the human collective.
Seems like we would need a degree of maturity as a human race in order to go in that direction, or need some kind of like spiritual evolution or flowering that, it's my personal belief, is happening, even though perhaps too slowly for what we need. But do you believe the change will happen in a spiritual sense? And are you an optimistic or pessimistic guy about if we're going to make it or not?
Yeah, I guess I mean, I think we will make it. I mean, I think we're going to see a lot of calamity in the next decades, but crisis is also forces us to change. I mean, and we're already seeing, we saw with the coronavirus, in a way that seems threatening, but companies and governments started to work together like really rapidly. We're seeing it with Russia, all these companies and governments now like joining forces to try to deal with this threat. And so then the next threat on the horizon, assuming that we don't end up in a nuclear war, is the ecological emergency. And that's going to force like rapid adaptation, and a lot of things that seem impossible now, like, oh, we'll never be able to make that change. Suddenly when we're forced to make the change, we might find that we can change things so quickly on so many levels.
But do you think the governments and these corporations that are tied into it actually have those good intentions of healing a virus, helping with a war, helping with the environmental catastrophe, or are they just using these as excuses to continue to control the people and do as they want?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's both in a way, some of both. I mean, it's hard to generalize, but I mean, there's a lot of people in a government or corporation, and, I mean, obviously, like if we look in the U.S., like the right wing, the Republicans seem to have really lost their minds and got into like a delusionary state. As have some of the Democrats and so on. So, but I mean, I think it's when crisis happens, people have to deal and they have to adapt to the new reality of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I hope that some of them in power have good intentions to help heal and help with these problems while not totally fucking over the small man in the process of it. So let's talk about aliens. What's your belief about aliens? As somebody who researches metaphysical realms and psychedelics and afterlife and all this stuff, what's our relationship with aliens? Are there different kinds? What's their objectives? What's their communication with us? What have you learned?
Yeah, I mean, I've stopped kind of having beliefs around it. I mean, as I said, when I wrote this book, 2012, there's like 100 pages in the book about these patterns, the crop circles that appear in mainly in England and southern England. They're not as many as appear anymore, and they're not quite as amazing as they were. But 1999, 2001, 2003, 2005, they were like unbelievable. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, I researched it. I talked to artists who claim to be responsible for the phenomenon, but I also talked to like physicists who'd written peer-reviewed science papers about kind of how the changes were, the plants were molecularly altered in these formations, and land surveyors and designers and so on, who basically argued that in the amount of time that these things appeared, there was no way that a bunch of humans had done them to this level of perfection. And then I went into many of them, and sometimes would have kind of like psychic experiences or incredible synchronicities or whatever. So I definitely think that there are levels of different types of whatever you want to call them, interdimensional beings. Some people think that maybe the crop circles are made by like future us, in a way, coming back through time. Mm-hmm. Then there's like the really super bizarre phenomena of like the gray aliens and all these kind of negative, manipulative abductions, which I also haven't heard as much about recently. I don't know if it's people are just not reporting it anymore, if it's kind of being backburnered.
But it seems like there's like a process of disclosure these days, like the United States, Pentagon are releasing all these videos of UFOs, or I don't know.
Yeah,
what the
but it
new
still
name
remains kind of maddeningly insufficient, and it always seems like it gets to a certain point, like you think there's going to be a huge breakthrough, and then it sort of closes back down again. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I think we were talking about like Nassim Haramin last night, and he's been, he's really fascinating. He believes that there is the potential to draw, an infinite source of like free energy from the underlying structure of the vacuum.
Right.
And he believes that earlier civilizations who maybe were partnered with extraterrestrials had access to this technology, and it was utilized by like Egypt, that maybe it ended up being the Ark of the Covenant, because in the Bible they describe things that sound like an anti-gravity device. Like Moses may have used the Ark of the Covenant to part the Red Sea. So it was like some kind of like free energy technology that was extremely powerful. But then why don't we have it now? And it could be that it's being, people know about it, it's being suppressed, or somehow it may be that there needs to be some tipping point of consciousness. Like we actually, because in the Bible, for instance, if somebody tries to use the Ark of the Covenant and they're not at a certain level of like initiation or awareness, it'll just burn them up and they'll die. So it might be kind of the same thing with the ETs and the UFOs and all this stuff. It's like it can't have any coherence as long as we're still trapped in kind of this old structure of consciousness. And even people who feel that they've maybe gotten beyond it, maybe they haven't quite yet. They're still it's too much the mainframe.
Yeah, we're not there yet. Maybe it's a thing of frequency. We can't see the aliens in a physical way because they've surpassed that frequency, and the technologies are would burn us because it's a higher octave of where we're at right now. And hopefully we do evolve and get to a higher frequency, and can access free energy and talk to the aliens and the Mayans.
And then also, there's the sense that many of us have when we work with the entheogenic plants, that there are other forms of consciousness that kind of exist in a kind of super sensible way, that are ready to communicate with us when we are in the right receptive mode.
Totally. So
I feel like we need we should have like an embassy, for trying to communicate with all these different plants, like the ones that you talked about, the diet plants, and the dolphins, the cetaceans, who also seem to have, a tremendous level of awareness, in some ways, beneath us, but in other ways maybe far advanced of what we can even imagine,
Totally. So you got to keep on doing the work, meditate, and try to listen to what's invisible to us right now. So you're an interviewer too, right? Like, do you got your own podcast, or where do you interview people?
I haven't really been doing it much lately. I've been more like just reading and thinking for a while.
Who have you interviewed in the past, and what's some interesting things you've learned from them?
Have I interviewed in the past? It's been a while. I haven't really been doing interviews as much.
Well, the last one was Robert Kennedy Jr.
Yes. Okay, now you remind me of that. Right. So, sure, that was very interesting. Unfortunately, that got sort of wiped off of Instagram, as he got wiped off of Instagram.
Right.
What
do you think about that? Does he deserve to be wiped off of Instagram?
I think it's very complex. I know that there's a big outcry against censorship. And I personally, my preference would be that these people stayed. But sometimes I have to ask myself, do I really, I have to be honest, I'm kind of glad that Donald Trump was taken off of Twitter. I felt that he was causing like a huge amount of damage to people and into their psyches, including myself, like just reading those horrible things every day. And, these are private companies. And so it's kind of like if you own a private bar and somebody comes in every day, like screaming at the top of his lungs, and all these other people start following him, and you ultimately might have to force that person, not to come anymore. So, I don't know. Sometimes I feel that we're sort of negotiating a very delicate thing here.
Because so I could understand Trump, but once you you can, shut up the president of a country, then you can shut up like any other small person who doesn't even have any power.
But as I said, if these were, public trusts, it would be we'd have to think about them differently, because they're private companies. It's just extremely complex. And I have read there's like an article in the Atlantic Monthly that actually, China does all this stuff, all the censorship through the government, but we're actually learning to do the same thing using these private companies, which I really don't think is good or healthy. But I also, sometimes people are really purveying bad information. I don't think that's the case with RFK. I think he's very complicated. I also wrote a very close review on my Substack blog of his book on Anthony Fauci. And I got a lot out of that book in terms of understanding what happens, in terms of the coronavirus and the vaccines, and also like how there was like all of these kind of meetups over years where the military and the governments and companies had prepared for this type of virus and kind of had a playbook of what they would do, and that included, censorship and denouncing anti-vaxxers, and really a lot of it like point by point. So that was kind of upsetting to discover, and then also Kennedy points out that essentially the military in the U.S. had wanted to keep doing work on bioweapons, but it was made illegal through like I don't know, it was the Geneva Convention or another convention. So then they were able to kind of do it through gain of function research through the National Institute of Health. So the coronavirus, I believe, was engineered in a lab, and it looks like both the U.S. and the Chinese governments were supporting this research, and it was some kind of weird, like edgy, like bioweapons research, and they've totally refused to admit to that. So that's terrifying. I mean, it's a mess. So I think Kennedy has been useful in opening up a lot of questions. But when I interviewed him, I was kind of surprised, because he is against, he was really against like all vaccines. And he believes that like, polio and smallpox vaccines, it was really more that hygiene had gotten better, and medicine, other types of preventive medicine had gotten better, sanitation had gotten better, and the vaccines really didn't contribute very much. I mean, as far as I understand it, I'm still of the opinion that these were like medical marvels that saved like millions of lives and so on. So I was a little surprised by how dogmatic he was, but this is like, the difficulty of our time, right? Because we and everything like leads us to become more extreme. Like we have an idea or a feeling, then we find the information that supports that idea or that feeling, and that carries us like further and further in a certain direction. And we're seeing how messed up that is.
What about Russell Brand? Have you interviewed him, or has he only interviewed you? What's your relationship with him?
I did interview him. I had a talk show on Gaia years ago.
Oh, cool. What was it called?
It was called Mind Shift.
Okay, cool.
And then we did a number of things together. I mean, he took a lot from my work. He wrote a book called Revolution, where he has a few chapters talking about how because I guess I sort of synthesized like the ecological, the political, and the spiritual, or the mystical in a way that was like new for him. And he still cites like my posts. Recently we did a thing for Under the Skin, and generally I'm really supportive, and I think he's amazing, and he's an incredible showman, and it's like you can watch week by week the numbers on his YouTube are exploding. I've been very uneasy about the way he's approached the Russia and Ukraine war. I feel that he's gotten a little bit trapped in a ideological left-wing perspective, where he's only reading like magazines like, and I like these magazines like the Jacobin and the Intercept and so on. Whereas I really do kind of feel that this is like a different situation, where it is kind of like a good versus evil thing, where you have Putin, who's running an military dictatorship, autocracy. Whereas if Russell lived in Russia now, he would be killed for what he was saying, generally for what he was talking about. So. And they're trying to stomp out a country that was moving in the direction of liberal democracy and wanted to embrace kind of Western values, and they seem to be now, we're learning, even having like a genocidal, like they were bringing like mobile crematoriums into these cities, and they had like lists. It's like, it's really horrible on the level of like Second World War horror, and I'm not really happy that leftist thinkers like they're pundits like Russell, who I love and respect, are not seeing that they're trapped in their kind of anger against the liberal West and the governments and our fiascos with the military and our war crimes and so on. And that's all true. Like the Iraq War was incredibly horrendous, but we also have to take every situation as the situation that it is. And right now, my personal feeling is that Ukraine actually does need to stop Russia, because he's not going to stop at Ukraine.
Is that possible?
What's that?
Is that possible that Ukraine would beat Russia?
They've been kicking Russia's butt so far.
No way.
Yeah, you haven't been following?
I don't look at the news.
Yeah.
Because I never know what to believe, so I'd rather not.
Yeah, no, I mean, well, you can, but I mean, that's interesting because if you get into it, then you can actually watch all these videos of like these burning columns of like Russian tanks. I mean,
but I don't know if it's true or not. I
Well,
don't even know if
but I
that
mean-
tank is a Russian
hold on
or
a second,
from some
but I mean,
other
but I
war.
mean, that's where I think you have to be really careful because it's like the danger in our corrupted and polluted information environment is that we become so relativistic that we can't see anything as true, and then we're kind of trapped. So and I've worked for the New York Times, I've written for them, like they do bias, but they also are rigorously fact checked, and the CIA has at times infiltrated them and created false stories, but that's not like always the case. I mean, I think that we were in a period that requires like a lot of discernment, and you can actually look at like the New York, the Russia is saying we didn't do these war crimes, but then the Times not only found the photographs, they found the timed satellite imagery that shows how these bodies ended up in a certain place. So it's like, there's a lot of evidence, and that's like, I mean, I do a lot of research and exhaust myself sometimes because you can really go down into these rabbit holes and make discernment, for yourself. But,
Right.
I mean, in this case, it really does seem to be the case that, the Russians have lost, 10 to 20,000 soldiers, which is an unbelievable amount of soldiers or more, and they've lost an unbelievable amount of equipment, and they're sort of in retreat and regroup mode. The West doesn't want to get involved because of the threat of nuclear war, basically.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is that Putin is using that threat every time we try to go against him. So, I can understand it's a very tough situation, but I don't think we can allow, a Hitler-like dictator to just annihilate, civilian populations and other countries over and over again. So in a way, for me, this has actually been eyes-opening in terms of remembering that there are, values and principles in our, corrupt and messed up liberal democracies that, are failing us in some ways and are, we talked about China with the policies around the mandates and what they have with the truckers and so on, and moving more towards the sort of, kind of neoliberal authoritarianism. And that sucks, but it's still better than autocracy or like, this type of what's happening in China and Russia, in Brazil, where there's no freedom of speech, like an indigenous population can just be killed or relocated. There's no rule of law. It's just like state power. So I still think we actually more than ever have to really make these distinctions and be like, okay, like, this is our thing is far from perfect, but it's like still needs to be protected and even cherished compared to having a system with no freedom of speech where you're totally under the boot of a, military government and so on.
So we're bad, but there's worse.
Exactly.
So let's fight the worst. Well,
yeah, so that's, I think, one of the problems. Like, we always want to separate between good and bad,
Mm-hmm.
and in some cases we got bad and worse, or these like degrees, that we have to really reckon with in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I hope that all occupations end, including Ukraine, Syria, Palestine, etc. It's not the only one, and may all countries be free to do their thing without another country coming in and saying how they're supposed to do things, which seems to be like the case. So back to the information wars.
Yeah.
It seems like each one of us has to be like a full-time investigator to know what the truth is. Like, we can't fully trust the corporate media, and then there's the side of misinformation or extreme conspiracy theories. I guess the answer you already told me. You have to like do mad research, but how can the normal person like myself, who's busy already with a career and a full life, get any grasp on what's real and what's a lie? Like, who can we trust?
Yeah, really. I can't help you there.
Because I love checking out Russell Brand, for example, I always hear his points, and I find him like smart and articulate and kind of like in the middle. But of course, he's very criticizing on the media that now is coming hard on him. I can see he's taking it a little bit personal and kind of like defending himself a little bit extra than usual when he was just giving opinions that didn't have that feeling with it. I've thought about if you could have like
You know, like, I mean, maybe blockchain, you know, could allow for some type of like social network where, you know, people would build trust in different areas over time, and you would, you know, feel you had more reason to trust somebody. But it's a mess right now. It's a really dangerous mess, you know.
Right. Well, hopefully our spiritual intuition grows and we can see through the lies and like have intuition to tell us what sounds right and what sounds wrong. So we're coming to the end of our interview.
Yeah.
Would you have some final words of wisdoms to the millions and millions of viewers watching our show today?
I guess, you know, do the work of thinking for yourself, and you know, try to take, you know, more responsibility for what you can. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel.
Thank you.
It was beautiful.
Yeah.
And thank you, the viewers of Chris Dyer's Creative Friends. Thank you for watching this week. Please like, comment, share, etc. Subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Blessings. Woo! Next episode, my guest will be Crystal Smith.
So many people stop themselves from expressing themselves out of a fear of it not being good enough, or they don't know how to do it, and it's like a gap in actually like diving more deeply into their own unique expression. And so I really just encourage people to let go of that inner critic, to explore new ways of working and creating, and to find their own style and language, and let that just sort of naturally evolve. You know, the world needs us to show up with our open hearts and creative expression, and the more that we do that and share that with each other, I think the more beautiful of a world that we're going to live in.
So please make sure to subscribe, like, comment, and share. Big thanks, and see you next episode. Peace.